Are now officially recording this meeting, and I want to welcome everyone, do a quick introduction of everyone on the Veeam team and talk about our agenda for the next, 51 minutes. So welcome, SureBackup workshop. We just mentioned this pre-recording that we have a number of customers that ask about SureBackup. Everyone owns, right, quote unquote, owns SureBackup as part of their implementation. Not enough people use it. I'm not sure everyone understands the value or really how to set it up. And in all honesty, we don't spend enough time talking to customers about it. So the idea here was get whoever's interested on a call. They can grill the Veeam people as much as they want, right? Ask whatever questions they want. We'll do some stuff together. We'll chit chat amongst ourselves on the Veeam team and record this for future presentation. So real quick, Randy Lee, I'm a Veeam SE out of the Milwaukee, Chicago area. I've been with Veeam for about a year and a quarter. If the rest of the Veemers could quickly introduce themselves, please.
I'm Joe Monahan. I'm a technical trainer at Veeam. Been here for a little over 3 years and have known Randy for quite some time.
Daniel Clems, systems engineer out of the Minneapolis area, and a newer addition to the Veeam team starting in December, but not new to data protection.
And this is Carlos Talbot, Enterprise SC, based here in Chicago. You can tell from my Cubs hat, covering Illinois and Wisconsin. And no, Randy, far too long.
He knows all my jokes, all 7 of them.
And I'm Tyler Ramby. I'm another Veeam SE out of Austin, Texas. Been at Veeam for about 3.5 years. And yeah.
Very good. So I'm going to get started. I want to show some quick notes, kind of level set for anyone interested, whether you're watching live or watching the recording. And by the way, if you have questions, this is an open forum. This is meant to be a live Q&A, not a one-to-many broadcast. So I want to show you some content I put together. Well, I guess I'm always working on it, right? But it's been around for a little over a year. I'm often asked what SureBackup is and why it's important. So we do a lot of health checks, right? We'll look at a customer's environment. We'll look at their jobs. We'll look at their repositories. We'll look at their scale of repositories, their cloud strategy, and all that stuff. And then we get to this SureBackup, and it always kind of pauses there. Well, I've heard of it. I don't really know what it is. I understood, completely get it. It is an unusual, unique concept, right, to Veeam, and very powerful. So the idea is that I can verify my backups with SureBackup. So put this in context, I used to be an IT director in healthcare, and I remember the call specifically from my CIO. Do we know our backups work? Can we recover in the event of a disaster? And I said, I don't have a clue. I have no clue. And he said, this is not acceptable. I go, I completely agree, right? I have no way of testing my entire environment. How would I even do that, right? Sort of bringing everything down. So, therein, right, lies the need for SureBackup. So I could take my backups, right? I protect my systems. Maybe I'm doing dailies, maybe I'm doing weeklies, whatever I want to do. And I could take individual elements, jobs, maybe my key systems, maybe specific systems, however I want to do it. Bring those up in an isolated environment, right? Sometimes you call it a masqueraded environment. The idea is, by utilizing a data lab, ensure recoverability of backup systems. So when my CIO calls me up and says, Randy, do our backups work? I can say, yes, we use SureBackup to test them every week or every month, or we tested these systems and not those systems. Very cool. You can take that a step further and have a sandbox, right? I want to be able to look at my environment, or take an element of my environment rather, put it in an isolated area, apply some tests, see what happens if. Interesting. So we want to know what happens if we change this, or maybe I'm going to do some scanning offline, right, of systems. I'm going to look for something specific. I can utilize that incredibly large footprint of my data target, right, for scanning. A couple components that are key to this: application groups and data labs. And we'll show these in our lab, but the data lab is that isolated network, right? It's a very specific network that cannot communicate with the production network. That is key, right? So I can have two servers named Alpha 1, two servers named Beta 1, whatever I'm using. They do not talk to each other. As an admin, right, I can get to that sandbox environment or the SureBackup environment, but it's not going to interfere with anything on my production. Now, there's some caveats with that. If I bring up a SQL server that doesn't have access to DNS or domain authentication, it's not really going to work, right? So that's why we get into this concept of application groups, and we'll show that momentarily. We always talk with the 3-2-1 rule with data protection, and kind of a reminder, right? 3 copies of my data, 2 different devices with 1 offsite. And I've seen all kinds of variations of this. I've seen 4-3-1, right? I've seen all kinds of different elements. We generally don't like to talk about 3-2-1-1-0. Yeah, 3-2-1-0, right? Where I have 3 copies of my data, 2 different devices, 1 offsite. There should be another 1 in that, by the way. 1 immutable, right? So air gapped, and then 0 errors. And this last 0 in this link is about SureBackup. A quick picture, then we're going to kind of jump into our lab and get some input here from the people at Veeam. So here's a diagram I put together that kind of shows what SureBackup is. So I have my environment. I have multiple hosts. Host 1, host 2, host 3. I'm running 5 VMs. Now I probably have a lot more, right? But for this diagram, I have 5 on a couple different networks. Here's a production network. Here's a production network running on these 3 hosts. I do backups because I'm a quality, right, IT admin that's concerned about data protection. I'm a good custodian of my data. So I do my backup to this scale out backup repository. My backups get written here, let's say every night for simplicity. Maybe every Sunday morning or sometime when my resources are a little more available, right, when I won't impact any potential production systems, I can turn on these identical virtual machines, right? These are clones, right, 1-to-1, in an isolated network or a masqueraded network, call it what you want. Same IP addresses, different IP addresses, but a different network. The idea is, do these VMs turn on? Do they work, right? And we can get a report of this functionality. Heartbeat test, ping test, application test. I'll show you all this in the lab. Variety of methods to give you a determination on whether or not you can recover without actually going through the process. I'm not sure about the rest of you, but I kind of like having my weekends to myself. So this is the idea here. And by the way, I have this isolated network. I'm sorry, this isolated host down here too. Or this could be your same production host too. Maybe it's an existing host, maybe it's a separate host. Anyone want to comment from Veeam at this point? Otherwise, I'm going to keep moving forward.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify 2 quick things. First of all, you are launching from a backup file in that isolated environment. So you're not going to write anything back. Anything that you do in that SureBackup will not be written back to the file. It is purely pull it up, check it, qualify it, move on. Also, too, Randy brought up a really good point, but I want to clarify just a little bit more. A SureBackup job, when it does its application test, in most cases, it's just going to go do a telnet call to see if the service launched.
Sure.
It's not going to go check your databases or anything like that. What it's meant for is an automated that you can schedule, launch, check, report, shut down. And it's for very specific services. But a sandbox allows you to leave it up and running longer. So if somebody had to do extended database testing, if somebody had to check to see if email actually was working, that's where the sandbox comes into play. But the only difference is a checkbox to say, keep this up and running after the test is done. But that clarification is something that a lot of people miss, because when we say test your backups, the first thing that comes to mind is, I don't have enough hosts to double every VM that I have in my entire environment at the same time. That's not really the idea. You pick your criticals or your subcriticals, as I call them. And this is an opportunity to launch, go through the 3 tests Randy talked about, make sure it works, kick out a report, shut it down. That's it. But the most important thing is you're not writing to the backup.
Yeah, you don't need to run them all at the same time, all your tests.
Exactly, yes.
I have different business systems. I quantify, right?
Yeah.
Identify my business systems, and I run them in isolate. Maybe I do different business systems every Sunday.
Yeah.
or whatever's along with your business schedule.
Yeah, so it's a really good definition and phenomenal layout of all of it, Randy. I was just the two that I run into class all the time where people get incredibly confused quickly when we bring up both SureBackup and Sandbox, and they wonder why are there two different elements. And SureBackup to me is that insurance policy, as I call it, that it's just running and sending reports to let people know that we have tested those backups. But what level do they want them back tested? And that's where the Sandbox comes in. When they want to go beyond Telnet, I would recommend Sandbox, giving somebody an opening to go into the console, do their testing. But they need to understand that if they find a problem, they need to go to production, use that Sandbox to document how to fix it, prove the repo, and then go back to production, fix it, and then do a new backup. Because too many people think that we write it to the backup. That's your gold. We'll never write over a backup. So there you go.
All good points. And the difference in configuration between a SureBackup and a Sandbox is literally a checkbox right in the job. And we'll show you that in the lab.
One other thing too.
Please.
Again, I didn't want to jump into as well. Is the aspect around the networking pieces. And the networking pieces are one of the biggest challenges when it comes to SureBackup and it comes to the virtual labs. And it gets a lot of people really, twisted around the axle when it comes to that. And there's a couple of different ways to approach that. And again, we can definitely whiteboard this or bring this piece up, but most people will look at this from a single host perspective. They'll put their virtual lab on a single host and they'll do their testing on one host. Some people will ask, well, maybe if I want to test across multiple hosts, and that complicates things a little bit because you have to be able to distribute that network traffic across multiple hosts while maintaining that isolation. And again, we can do that within the VMware space, obviously with a virtual distributed switch. But things get even more interesting too, because there are some DR use cases where it actually requires you to access a physical box, which is outside of the virtual space. So how the heck do you do that? Well, we can even do stuff with VLANs. So you can actually engage a VLAN and do an isolated VLAN as part of it to be able to access things that are virtual and not virtual. So in the term that we're using virtual labs to do this, it's actually a little bit of a misnomer because you can actually do things outside of the virtual space and integrate that into your DR and backup testing.
Yeah, so there's a variety of scenarios you can put in play, right? There's an easy one, but it can get more complicated, and that's where you will want to engage your partners, right? Or VMSEs such as ourselves.
You want to be absolutely sure you know what you're doing when it comes to the VLAN and some of the separation pieces, because you can get yourself in trouble very rapidly if you have your Sandbox environment accessing production resources. So again, yes, be very clear when it comes to the network isolation and to know what resources have access to what as part of this. Otherwise, the single host configuration is perfectly capable and it can provide the functionality that most people are looking for without any undue risk in the environment.
If nothing else, it's a great starting point, right? Single host, try a few, get your feet wet, see the value of it, right? And then invest more in the technology.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of talk about ransomware lately. It's all over the news. It's growing. It's getting worse. Please, please, please have a well-documented, well-architected ransomware remediation plan, and we can help you with that. That's a kind of a separate but related topic to what we're doing here. I do like to talk about Veeam Secure Restore, right? The antivirus scan element of it. So I'm not sure about this server. I'm concerned. I can bring that server up in my sandbox, right? I'm using the SureBackup technology and enable an antivirus scan or an anti-malware scan. There's all kinds of steps I can do to further help isolate, eliminate, prevent the spread, if you will, of ransomware attacks. So very cool element.
Super quick point on that, Randy, is that some ransomware is effectively triggered either by a date or it's triggered by a command signal. And so what will happen a lot of the times with ransomware is that after you get infected, even if you go through and restore your backups, if you've not removed the agent that actually is doing the operations, they can receive the trigger command again and it can start the process all over again. So one of the things you can do as part of the SureBackup function is to grant internet access to these machines. So if they originally had access out to the internet, so if there's a malicious agent that's going to go out there and then going to trigger that operation again, if you haven't removed or fully remediated that, you can actually use that as an ability to be able to test and say, did I get everything? And that one is a really important one. I previously worked at Symantec, and so that was one of the things we always looked at, was we were looking at outbound traffic and seeing if somebody was trying to make a connection out to a foreign IP address or something that was under enemy control, basically.
Yeah, ransomware is preventable, but it takes some time. It takes really architectural, right, design and a few triggers, right, or a few monitoring characteristics. We talked about canary files, things like that. Kind of a separate dialogue, but related to the SureBackup. Again, I'll be sending you this link after this call. Here's a few other really cool videos, a 3-minute read here. Here's some stuff from Michael Cade, right? I'll make sure you get a copy of this list. I do also have some great videos here, a 3-minute video, a 5-minute video, 13-minute video. These are links that either Veeam people or Veeam advocates have put together. Again, you'll see this link momentarily in a couple of videos down here. So let's get into the meat of this. Let's go into my lab environment here, and let's go into VBR. All right, so in my environment, I have a variety of proxies, I have repositories, I have scalar repositories, but let's go down to the key here, SureBackup. And Daniel, I think I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about virtual labs, if you're okay with that.
Sure. Well, again, a virtual lab is one thing for us. It's actually a persistent VM that exists out in the environment. So when you set up your virtual lab, you're actually configuring all of the network rules. So this is acting as a gateway or the gatekeeper for the network traffic. So when a virtual lab is set up, then for all of your SureBackup jobs, for any virtual machines that are spun up as part of the SureBackup job or the sandboxing, their network is pointed into the virtual lab and then allows you to actually mediate that access. So when you configure this, you actually go into the configuration for the virtual lab. Again, you'll specify what are the networks that I've got attached to it. Is there any translation rules that I'm going to be doing as part of it? Are there specific switches or access that I want to grant to it? So that's all created as part of the initial setup for that. So the virtual lab, again, if you think about that, it's a VM that you'll see sitting out in the environment consistently, but that's one that you've configured it once, and then every time that you execute a SureBackup job or doing anything around the virtual labs, it's going to power that on and connect the VMs through its network infrastructure to control that, to act as the gatekeeper.
And I can have multiple virtual labs. Maybe I have one in each data center location, or maybe one in a remote location, maybe one on my DR site, and they all have different characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at a virtual lab in our lab. So if I go to virtual labs, I have one virtual lab set up here. It's VLab Central. Let's look at the characteristics of this virtual lab.
Very quickly, Randy, just wanted to ensure that we understood this. So as we're looking at this, we always assume that we're pulling this and launching it as a virtual machine, and people that assume that this is running off of production storage. Like we said before, you're going to be as fast as the storage that the backup file is sitting on. And what we see a lot is people have it sitting on maybe a slower dedupe appliance, not realizing it. So that might be something as you go through, you might want to bring up that, the mileage may vary depending on where your backup file resides.
So interesting point, we're always asked about target repositories, right, as SEs. It's a hard question to answer, right, because if you have an inexpensive target, right, that's fine for cost per terabyte, but doesn't allow you to really utilize some of these other features. You mentioned dedupe appliance, a perfect example. Dedupe appliance has a lot of value, but there's also an opportunity cost around things like virtual lab and SureBackup, and even instant recovery. So if I look at my virtual lab, right, here's my VLab Central. It's on this host, right, and you can select a host, select multiple hosts, but we're going to choose this host here, right? If I look at my data store, there may be reasons to change this, right, but by default, your rights will go to your vPower NFS. That's the whole technology behind this cache. I could redirect them if I choose to, right? But we're going to leave that alone, leave it at the default setting. Proxy, right? Use proxy appliance in this virtual lab. It's recommended, right? So here's the whole idea of data store, production network. There's a variety of mechanisms I can change here, I can, turn it off. There's things I can do right around my virtual proxy. I can either configure it to have, different IP settings. Here we have a static IP address, right, and production network, right. On my next tab is my network. Here's where it gets kind of interesting, and this speaks to Daniel's point earlier about basic single host, advanced single host manual configuration, right, or advanced multi-host. I oftentimes hear, advanced single host is the right way to start. I may argue that a little bit, saying that a basic single host configuration may be a good place to start if you're new to virtual labs, right? Anyone want to comment on that from the Veeam side?
Sure. Again, it really comes down to what some of the requirements are for where the resources are going to reside. So again, if you've got some static resources that sit out there in a backup environment or a testing environment, so maybe you have a DNS server that's constantly running in a testing environment, so you use that for just playing around with it. You could utilize that as part of your network configuration. Again, it really comes down to looking at the virtual labs and saying, what portions of the production environment do I need to include as part of it to make my testing valid? And so again, a lot of people will do this with either they'll have a static environment set up where they've constantly got a secondary domain controller, which is maybe read-only, that sits in that environment. So that way no changes are made or actually promoted up into the production space. Or maybe every time that you do that SureBackup test, I want to take last night's copy of Active Directory Domain Controller and bring that up into the environment. So again, it all depends on what the requirements are. And a lot of this is going to be driven based on the applications that exist inside of the environment and what sort of interdependencies they're going to have inside of there. So again, this is definitely a situation where as a backup administrator or somebody from the infrastructure side, this injects you more into the conversation with the application owners to have a better understanding of what the actual dependencies are. And sometimes that conversation gets interesting because you may or may not, they may or may not know what those are, right?
Right.
You could go to them and say, hey, SQL admins, what do you need? And they go, my SQL server. And that's about as far as they'll go. They don't know that DNS is an interdependency. They don't know that Active Directory, because you've got an authentication component, is an interdependency. Maybe you've got some sort of certificate authentication server that's also tied with that. So again, it's a very interesting conversation, and I think a lot of it actually sort of kind of elevates the conversation when you start going into this portion, because in order to provide the maximum value, you have to have that better understanding to know what those application groups are. And the great part is that this actually helps you develop your DR runbooks even better, because the better you know all of these interdependencies and all the components, the better that you're going to have a feel for if application X fails, I know exactly what it needs, right?
So good point. So direction I was heading, SureBackup is like a mini DR plan, right? And if you break it down in manageable chunks, like the application groups, right? All the predicating tasks. I can't start a SQL server unless I have DNS. I can't start a SQL server unless I have domain credentials, right? It helps you understand, just like you said, what I need to do in a DR situation.
So now let me interject at a basic level. An opinion is about to come out, so I want to define that. All right, let's define. A fact is your shirt is orange. An opinion is your shirt is ugly. All right, orange is not ugly for everyone. My opinion is there should be a dotted line between the second and third radial button, because the first and second radial button, all of us obviously know that it's so easy to set up because you just remove the uplink and boom, you have an isolated environment. The third one, you're talking about distributed switching, VLANs, and I can tell you one wrong click and you're opening up your domain controllers and your exchange to production while they're running side by side. So I would tell people constantly, the first two in a VMCE class, we can get you up and running with those two in a matter of minutes, very straightforward. The networking portion, I did send you a mini slide, animated slide, Randy, if you wanted to touch on that for the networking. It's pretty self-explanatory. But the third one, I always say, have someone help you the first time. If you have somebody sit down with you that's done it before, they will show you the ins and outs, and they'll, just like was just mentioned, they will know the questions to ask and you will know the answers to give them before they open anything up, because they don't know what you have running in your network.
Right.
Now, I will say the third radio button, what I've been running into is people saying instantly, okay, so what about NSX? They all of a sudden throw that in. Do not touch that conversation. Get them back to the distributed switch first, because there's no real need to have NSX in there per se, unless they have a requirement for it. So if you can remove that, it'll simplify your life. But beyond that, everything else should be pretty straightforward.
So if you're new to SureBackup, maybe start with basic single host and then move from there,
And
or maybe advanced single host.
Just for recording documentation purposes, VMware NSX is a different networking stack which provides a different type of networking interface. So instead of a traditional network interface, you can go to microsegmentation and have a lot of the network rules follow with the virtual machine. So
it adds a whole new layer of, oh my goodness, to your entire solution. But it's awesome. It's an incredible solution. But boy, it's like taking all the externals and making them external instantaneously. So
whole new layer of, oh my goodness. That's a good quote. So let's move on a little bit. Again, we could go into more depth on this topic if you'd like. Isolated networks, we talked a little bit about this, right? I can add isolated networks to my environment, right? My production network, my isolated network. If I edit, right? There's my production, and here's the isolated network. Again, same IP address, different IP address. There's a variety of things I can do with that. Why change it? Right? If you don't have to change it, why bother? And I can have
now, something to point out very quickly, Randy. Can you open that prior interface up again under Edit?
Mm-hmm.
Copy what you have down there first so you don't lose it. But although that's a drop down, you can type over that and change that naming. And that's one of the things in the official class that we actually have to rename that. So that's something that a lot of people, when you think drop down, you think locked in naming. And we add the feature that you can change a locked in name. But in reality, this is what causes most people to break their lab in our labs, is they don't properly rename this to match their networks or their configs. So make sure that they're aware that you can add or remove information from that drop down. It's an odd setting, but it's possible.
I was not aware of that. Thank you. Very good news. So network settings, right? So connect each isolated network to a proxy appliance VM, right? Just like you would do with a physical. The idea is, my VNIC, I have my isolated network, my production network, masquerade, right? IP, right? It's going to emulate, right, your production environment, and it's not DCP enabled. I can go to edit here, and I can see the variety of choices, right? IP address, enable DCP, however I want to do it. Again, this is a networking conversation. Put a little thought into how you like your data moved. Static mapping, right? It's static IP address mapping makes corresponding virtual lab VMs accessible from any computer in the production environment. Interesting. So I can take any computer that I'm normally running in my environment and allow it to access the SureBackup, right? The virtual lab. A little dangerous, right? But there are certainly opportunities. So Daniel, you and I were talking about this earlier. If you have a SureBackup environment running and you want it to access some NAS device or something somewhere else, you could do that through here.
Yeah, and again, it all depends on the risk level of the service that is accessing it. So if you're accessing a data repository and you're not making changes from this SureBackup environment, and you're just retrieving data, pulling that into it, there's little to no risk when it comes to access to that. I mean, obviously from a credential standpoint, you want to make sure that there's not like one session limit, for example. But again, it really comes down to what do you need to make this test work successfully, and what do you want to test? Because again, we talked about doing the sandboxing for patching. One thing that we didn't talk about yet, and I don't know, are you going to be talking about staged restore, Randy?
Yeah, we can do that. So we have about 22 minutes. Yeah,
sure. Staged restore is another function that's built into the tool that's very powerful, and that is the ability to actually be able to take your backup, bring it into the environment, apply patching, apply transaction logs, apply things that bring it back up to where it needs to be, and then migrate that from the sandbox back into production. So you can do a staged restore as well. So it's not just saying that this is a static environment and you can't make changes. You can go in there, you can make changes using the right cache. But then if you say, my production environment is so hopelessly broken right now that I can't do anything with it, well, geez, I've got a running copy right now running in my sandbox. I'm just going to promote that back, and it's now going to be my production copy. So that is something that a lot of people miss too when it comes to the power of this tool, is that there's so many different scenarios you can take advantage of, not just saying, yep, my backup works.
So let's
And to
review that.
Daniel's, yeah, to Daniel's point very quickly, Randy, the best way to explain this fundamentally is that router in between is the router at your house. It's a NAT router. So if you wanted to allow someone from the outside world to use your laptop as a web server, you would go to your router at home and you would create a rule that says this outside IP address will also resolve internally to this internal IP address. So those are possible, but really don't make that information widely available, because like anything else, I've always said, as soon as you start a lab, it's now production. As soon as somebody goes into your lab and starts to test something, they'll never lie to shut it down again. So that would be a very unique case, but really that's the easiest concept for someone to understand. I joke with somebody that they could launch SureBackup with an Exchange server, sit at their desk, and if they made, and again, I'm not promoting this, I'm just showing you the power of this. You could open up yesterday's backup of your Exchange server, and while someone's looking over your shoulder before lunch, start deleting mailboxes and saying, yeah, those people didn't buy me lunch yesterday. Hey, are you guys buying me lunch? Right? And when you shut it down, it's going to throw that away because it's in cache. It's in a Delta file, and it was just testing a backup. But would you want to give somebody that access? Is it possible? Yes. I'm very much against allowing anybody to have that pass-through unless it's critical. And that's why a sandbox is important. If you opened up a SQL database, how do they get access to it? I would prefer to give them console access, but some people might want them to use a local client on their desktop to rev over a network to prove that it works. That is a possibility. Doesn't mean I recommend it, but it is a possibility. And don't go deleting
A lot of
emails
power
and
here.
getting.
Yeah, a lot of power here. Be real careful. But to review a little bit, I could take a server like Alpha One, bring it up in my SureBackup environment, do whatever I want to do to it in that SureBackup environment, and then go back to production. That is a cool power, right, with Veeam. Any more on this concept? By the way, here's everything that we just configured right in one big screen. I'm not going to hit apply because I don't think I made any changes, but I'm not going to anyway, right? Any questions or contributions or anything on virtual labs? Otherwise, we'll talk about application groups.
The only thing I'll tell you is this is a simple way to populate a Linux simple firewall NAT server. That's all we've done, is given you a simple interface, because you can actually log into our NAT router. It's a simple Linux box. Don't do it, but you can. It's possible.
Good point. Joe Monahan is the keeper of dangerous ideas. That's all right. So application groups, we talked about this a little bit before, right? Before I can enable a SQL server, power on a SQL server, I need to have basic foundational services in place, right? DNS, DHCP, Active Directory. Right? So let's take a look at one of these application groups. Let's look at the file server application group. And then the next thing we'll do in the last 15 minutes is look at the job itself. So here is an application group called file server. It has this virtual machine, ATL file 01. It's the virtual machines running production applications which other virtual machines are dependent on. In other words, predicating tasks, right, or predicating servers. If I go into edit, I can see some of the tests which we briefly talked about before. So actually, let's go back here a little bit. Right, here's my server.
Why do you go to the SQL server's job? Because that's got roles assigned.
Good.
That's what I made.
No, good point. So here's my SQL Server application group. It's containing these SQL servers, right? Look, here's a web server, here's a SQL Server domain controller. So when I think back to my days of managing IT, right, all of our web servers had some kind of back-end database. Our web servers had a back-end database server, and they had some kind of credentials that came out of something, right? This is a good example of testing a specific application, right? If I look, here's my SQL Server. If I go to edit, there are different roles I could test. So it is a SQL server. So I'm going to run scripts, right, that are oriented towards SQL servers or DNS servers or whatever I want to test, or a variety of roles. Here's my startup options. Note, I can change the amount of memory. So if you're concerned about bringing up your entire production environment, right, in a test environment, because of the amount of RAM it would consume, you can reduce that here. You know, I don't need to have a large amount of compute power for my SQL database starting up in my lab. I just need to know that it works. So there's a variety of mechanisms I can do to help ensure that that helps here, right? There's boot verification, right? VM heartbeat is present. VM responds to ping on any network interface. There's all kinds of startup options. Test scripts, right? Here's an example of a test script, right? It's that application here, right? SQL Server. There's a variety of options, right? Depending on what you're trying to do. And then credentials. I can use different credentials based on what I'm trying to do. So I have roles, right? I have startup options, test scripts, and credentials. Anything on this screen before I move next?
Next is really going to give you a summary. Can you do me a favor and cancel this out and start a new SureBackup job?
Sure. So go to SureBackup.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter which one you can use. Yeah, vSphere is going to be fine.
Okay.
Now, when you go forward, you'll see where it says application group. So just make it up until you get hit application group. Right there, it says no application group. That is an option. A lot of people assume that a SureBackup job requires an application group. What you're showing is if an Exchange server needs a domain controller, it's a dependency. So that's why we create those application groups to cover those dependencies. And then we check those boxes to ensure that we know those services are part of that process. But I've had a lot of people tell me they just wanted to test a file server. And the file server didn't require anything to be launched with it. So it's a very important little piece that people should understand, that use them wisely. That's what I will say. Don't put it in place or force one in place, because it could cause you problems as well.
Maybe it's an independent Linux server, or some work group based mechanism. You know, who knows what it is. I don't necessarily have a dependency. If I do, that's where I use application groups.
I'll tell you where I used one once, and I know it sounds pretty funny. I needed to prove to somebody that there was a dependency. So, so we launched something without the dependency and it wouldn't work. And I said, yeah, there you go. So there's another reason why you might use one.
So here's the application group called SQL servers. We looked at it earlier. Here's the VMs inside that application group. And remember, I mentioned there's one checkbox difference between a SureBackup and a sandbox. Here it is, right? Keep the application group running after the job completes. So if I don't have this enabled, these services start, my SureBackup job runs, I get the report, and then I power everything off. If I keep application group running, that allows me to do the stuff we talked about earlier, right? Go into my virtual lab, run whatever tests I want to do, apply a patch, you know, who knows, log into the console, all those extra functions. So I'm going to leave this off, right? Go to my linked jobs. So virtual machines from the selected backup jobs will be processed sequentially, keyword there, sequentially, once a specified application group is initialized. So I start my application group, right? I go to my linked job, and then I'm going to add a job such as VMware SQL Server. And maybe another one. Let's do VMware File Server. Note that I can process simultaneously up to, you know, 1 VM, 2 VMs, right? 3 VMs. On the Advanced tab, there's verification rules I can apply. So let's go out to SQL Server here, you know, ping test, heartbeat test, right? Or the roles. So again, the tests that we talk about are the heartbeat test, the ping test, and application testing, right? Those are the 3 elements of verification that we have. And that's where you do it. So linked jobs. So when people ask about how to set up my jobs, right, in Veeam, SureBackup is a consideration of that. I could have one backup job that does my entire environment, the whole thing, right? Or maybe I break them up into logical constructs, and one logical construct could be SureBackup related. Maybe I have an application called Monahan's Guitars, right? And Monahan's Guitars has a web server, a SQL server, whatever, maybe first 4 or 5 elements. Maybe I have a backup job specific to Monahan's Guitars, and I do SureBackup testing on Monahan's Guitars. Questions on that? Comments on that?
So one of the things that I would also include here, you're also talking about the ability to run these jobs and have a delay. And you also talked about checking the box. There's also, when you do multi-network single host, there's a checkbox that you really need to check or it won't talk between networks. So that's something we see in labs constantly, where someone will configure 4 or 5 networks and they'll forget to check the box in the interface, and it's very easy to miss it. But if you don't, you're not allowing them to talk between the networks. So the 2 big ones that I was going to bring up is that virtual switch or that virtual appliance in the middle that we use. You can have up to 9 separate networks in a test. Why? Who knows? But it's possible. Where that number comes from is you can have 10 virtual machine, or sorry, 10 virtual NICs in a single VM. 1 goes to production. That leaves you 9 more. That's where that rule comes from a VMware rule. So it's a good thing to note, but there are some people VLAN every single machine into its own network. If that's the case, if you're testing it, guess what? You're going to have to create multiple networks to make that work. So just wanted to make sure to include that.
I also say there needs to be a reason, right? Why am I putting a logical group together? There has to be a logical reason for it. So think about that as it relates to, well, your overall networking, right? But your SureBackup jobs too.
And like you said, think individually. Think Exchange is one SureBackup job. Think SQL is a SureBackup job. Think SAP is a SureBackup job. Don't think of an environment as a SureBackup job. Think of what is important to test.
Sure. From a CIO perspective, think about it as individual business systems you're responsible for. Messaging, right?
Yeah. And one last thing very quickly. People always ask this: application testing is an XML file. And if you look at it, 99% of the time, it's a telnet test to a port. And people always ask, hey, can you add more tests in there? I wouldn't recommend it. But my first question is, how good are you at XML? Right? Because we've made it as simple as possible. Did the service come online? But people do ask a lot. Again, we keep it very simple for SureBackup. That's where a sandbox, in my opinion, would come into effect.
All good
points. If you want to crack out those scripting skills, you go right ahead. We have that function.
How good are you? So on the settings tab, right, I can backup file integrity scan, right? Validate the entire virtual disk content. It looks for, data corruption, right? There's something not right with the backup file. That malware scan, we talked about this earlier. Scan the selected restore point for malware. Before I bring this up, I want to test it. I want to scan the entire image, right? And I want to skip application group machines from malware scan. I've already tested the application group. I don't need to do that again. Or maybe I want to test it again, right? There's a variety of options here.
Big value there, by the way. Big value before you move on. You can use the built-in Microsoft virus scanning solution, so you're not paying extra money. But on top of that, you can use a lot of different virus scanning solutions, so you can pick and choose the level in which you feel comfortable. We're not forcing you onto a certain solution. That's really important in this area, because a lot of people say, oh, so who do we have to use? That's not the point. You can use who you want. So that's really a phenomenal solution here.
So someone asked me if I worked in the cybersecurity industry. And before I answered, I thought about it, and I finally said, we all work in cybersecurity, right? Veeam is not a cybersecurity company per se, but it's a very key element of everything that we do. And you can see that here. Here's my email notifications.
We're an anti-ransomware cybersecurity company. We just happen to do backups.
Please have a good ransomware plan in place. I talked to a few customers that aren't that concerned, and I was perplexed by it. Okay, if you're not that concerned, that's fine, but I don't want to have this conversation again. I have others that are taking extreme. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't care about fixing the brakes in my car until my brakes go. Right? It depends on how fast I'm going to how critical that answer was.
On the flip side, I've had CIOs reach out to me on Saturday Can we talk first thing Monday morning because we're really concerned? Yes, right? Let's have that conversation. And then when I want to schedule my job, right? I want to run this every Sunday at 7 a.m., whatever I want to do for this backup job. So again, let's kind of go back, and we have about 5 minutes. The concept of SureBackup, I want to add that virtual lab. We talked about that. I want to add application groups. We showed you how application groups are set up, and then the SureBackup job itself. There's a whole lot of options. Please be thinking about what you're trying to accomplish. I do want to show you what a report looks like. Right, here's a SureBackup job, right? The job was successful. There were 4 tasks. 4 tasks were processed, 4 were successful, and nothing failed. 100%, right? Here's different tests that we ran, right? DNS 01 was a success. Heartbeat test was a success. The ping test was a success. We did not do malware or validation testing or custom scripts. This is a good report to keep a record of, right? If you have an assertive security team, and I think we all should, they can maintain this. Or if you have someone else in an operations team, whatever your process is, but keeping these is important. So you know, right, when people think about an audit situation. So again, I was in healthcare. I swear I had auditors ringing on my office every day. At least it seemed like it. And if I had something like this I can hand them, it would have made life a lot easier for me. So we have about 5 minutes left. Who wants to add some content or question?
I have to say again, to reiterate, auditors love this sort of stuff. Auditors not only love the reporting function, some auditors love it when they say, when was the last time you ran a test against your backup environment? You go, oh, hold on, right click, run SureBackup job. Run it right in front of their face and just be like, yep, okay, let's give me a few minutes, we'll get the report. Right?
Yep.
That sort of thing is extremely powerful for not only 2 things. First of all, you're verifying and validating for your own sake to know that it's working, but you're also able to immediately provide a report back to the auditor, and then they go, oh, okay, they know what they're doing. They're good.
I used to support before I was at Veeam, I supported one of our many products, which was a reporting tool. And I used to write on the board before we talked about it, reports equal argument enders. Because as soon as somebody starts to argue, if you put a report down on the table, it's theory versus tangible. And I'm telling you, 99% of the time, they'll fold right back and say, well, what's in your report? That's the beauty and the power of a report. Or with that said, you could put these in a centralized folder and give access to chief officers and managers so they also can look in here at any time to ensure that their services are online. To that point, I remember a CIO once asked me to include him in all the alarms. And I said, are you serious? You want to get woken up? He said, I'm going to give you an example, and always remember this. I've never forgotten it. He said, me not knowing that there's a problem is equivalent to me going into the CFO's office with a spreadsheet saying your numbers are off. He said, there's nothing more embarrassing than someone else telling me that there's a problem with my environment. And I thought, that's really powerful. So reports like this, when they're in one of those major meetings and they can show report after report, this really looks like they've got everything locked down and tested. It's really powerful.
My old CIO told me, Randy, I don't like surprises. Don't ever surprise me. Or worse yet, don't let him be surprised by someone else. This helps that. By the way, another thing I did with auditors, I always thought this was fun. They'd come to my office and I'd say, welcome to the office. Would you like to plug your laptops into our network? And they'd say yes. And I go, we don't allow that. And then I'd leave.
That's a perfect first test for network security. Like, would you like to plug into our network? Yep. Sorry, no. Hope you brought a hotspot because you're not getting on my network.
I kind of set the tone right up front with the guys, right? Game on. All right, we have a couple minutes left. Any other comments, questions, concerns? We could keep going, but I guess my request is if you want to set up SureBackup, reach out to your SEs, reach out to your partners, or whoever can help. Right? Definitely put this on your roadmap as an important element of your data protection, data recovery strategy.
Something we said earlier too, I want to define. When we just generally blanketed deduplication appliances are not good. Not all deduplication appliances fall into that category. There's been a lot of advances in the past, say 12 to 18 months, where there are dedupe appliances that could handle the load, but do they want it? I'm going to tell you, they probably don't want you sitting there running on something for any period of time. And the thing you want to be aware of with a sure backup job is you have to understand how long does it take to boot the machine you're talking about, and then the tests. And I can tell you from our labs, domain controllers don't boot quick. People always think it's broken because they think it's our solution, but VM or not, domain controllers take a while to come up. So you have to understand how long it takes for things to boot before it even can get to VMware tools, get to networking, and then get to the test. And how long does a service take before you can run a test against it? So those are all elements that you want to be aware of before you start something like this. But once those tests are done and the report is kicked off, it's all shut down. So that's all I'd say. I saw someone that created one of these that had like 12 VMs in it. And all of them, they were like one SQL database, then the next had to launch after that one, then the next one. I said, oh, you gotta be kidding me. How long does this take? They said, well, that's why they're complaining. It takes well over an hour to get a test done. But yeah, it's not a surprise. So yeah, be aware of the service and the load time. But beyond that, it shouldn't take super long.
All great questions. I think we're out of time. I'll be following up to anyone who registered for this session with a link to the recording, a link to a couple other little tidbits. Again, reach out to your local Veeam trusted partner. Always happy to help. So thank you everyone for your time, and thank you to all the Veeam people that joined me today.